something happened to you. Maybe 6 months ago, maybe last night, a message that ended something, a door that closed quietly, a person who walked out, a business that died, a phone call that split your life into a before and an after. On the outside, you handled it. You said the right things. You told everyone you were fine. Here's what nobody saw. 3 weeks later, you're sitting in your car in a parking lot with the engine off, and you're not going anywhere. You open your laptop at 9 in the morning, stare at the same screen until 2 in the afternoon, and get nothing done. You're not sad, exactly. You're not crying. Something inside you switched off, and you can't find the switch to turn it back on. Let's start with the science, because there's a story here most people have never heard. In 1967, two psychologists named Martin Seligman and Stephen Meyer ran one of the most famous experiments in the history of psychology. Animals were exposed to a stressor they couldn't escape. Later, when escape became easy and obvious, they didn't even try. They lay down and took it. They called it learned helplessness, and the conclusion spread everywhere. If life beats you enough times, you learn that nothing you do matters, and that learning makes you passive. For 50 years, that was the accepted answer. Then in 2016, in the journal Psychological Review, the same two men published a paper called Learned Helplessness at 50 and said something researchers almost never say. We got it backwards. 50 years of neuroscience had shown them that giving up was never learned in the first place. Shutting down is the factory setting. When a mammal takes prolonged pain it cannot escape, a small structure deep in the brainstem called the dorsal raphe nucleus floods the system with serotonin, and that flood actively suppresses the urge to escape. Automatic, unlearned. Standard equipment in every human being on the planet, including you. The thing that has to be learned isn't helplessness, it's control. There's a region behind your forehead, the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, whose job is to detect whether you actually have any influence over what's happening to you. When it detects control, it reaches down and switches the shutdown off. Your brain doesn't come pre-installed with strength, it comes pre-installed with collapse. Strength is software you have to install yourself. Think of the electrical panel in a house. Too much current hits the system, a breaker trips, the power cuts. That's not a defect. A house without that mechanism burns down. But a breaker isn't a fuse. A fuse dies once and gets thrown away. A breaker is built to be flipped back on by hand. So the entire question of whether you have power tonight comes down to this. Do you know where the panel is, and do you know that your hand is what resets it? Most people sit in the dark waiting for the lights to come back by themselves. So why does that control detector fail to develop in so many people? This is where it stops being about your brain and starts being about the world you live in. The detector learns like a muscle. It needs reps, repeated experiences of you pushing against something difficult and watching the difficulty move. Modern life has quietly removed almost every opportunity to do that while multiplying the opposite. Look at what fills your day: the economy. The comments under a post, political news engineered to keep you angry, a war on another continent, someone's opinion about your face, an algorithm deciding whether 3,000 strangers see your work. Every one of those is a genuine stressor, and you have exactly zero control over any of them. You absorb them 4 hours a day. That's 4 hours a day of your brain receiving pain it cannot act on, the precise laboratory condition that produces shutdown. Now look at what you've removed. You don't cook. Food arrives. You don't wait. It streams. You don't sit with boredom. You scroll. You don't have the difficult conversation. You leave it on read. You don't push through the hard workout. You skip it. Anything uncomfortable you could actually control has been deleted with a button. Stress you can't influence. Comfort that requires no effort. And nothing in the middle. Nothing left in your week where you struggle against something and win. Your control detector has no training data. It has never seen evidence that your actions change outcomes, so it has never learned to switch the shutdown off. You're not weak. You were never given the reps. That's a completely different problem. And unlike weakness, it's fixable. But before we fix it, you need to see 3 patterns that keep you in the dark, because most people aren't just missing the training, they're actively making it worse. Trap 1. Protecting your peace. You've learned a beautiful vocabulary for avoidance. You're setting boundaries, protecting your energy, honoring where you're at. And sometimes, genuinely, you are. But be honest for 10 seconds. When you cancel the meeting because you're not in the right headspace, when you don't send the message because now isn't the time, when you quit the course in week 2 because it was affecting your mental health, when you avoid the conversation with your father for the 4th year running because you're not ready yet. Every one of those was a controllable difficulty. Every one was a rep. And every time you delete a controllable difficulty, you're running a training session that teaches your brain one lesson. Hard things are things I move away from, not things I move. Here's the brutal part. Avoidance feels like relief, and relief feels like proof you made the right call. The trap rewards you every single time you fall into it. Meanwhile, the stress you can't control, the news, the strangers, the noise, you leave completely switched on. You have it perfectly backwards, shielded from the only stress that could make you stronger, drowning in the only stress that guarantees you stay weak. The cost is that your world quietly shrinks. Every year the list of things you can handle gets shorter, and you mistake that shrinking for peace. Trap 2. The fairness contract. This one hides inside intelligence, which is why smart people are most vulnerable to it. Something unfair happens, you get passed over, you get betrayed by someone you were loyal to, and instead of moving, your mind opens a case file. You replay it. Build the argument, rehearse what you should have said, explain it to friends and watch them agree you were right. Collect evidence that you didn't deserve this. And you were right. That's what makes it so sticky. It genuinely was unfair. But notice what you're doing with your energy. You're not trying to change the situation, you're trying to win a verdict. You want reality to admit it made a mistake before you agree to move forward. Reality never shows up to court. Psychologically, the fairness contract puts the power to release you into someone else's hands, because you've decided you can't move until they acknowledge what they did. The person who hurt you now controls the timeline of your recovery. You handed them the keys and called it standing up for yourself. The cost is months, sometimes years. Being right becomes more important than being free, and those two are almost never the same thing. Trap 3. Fusing the hit to who you are. There's a difference between the business failed and I am a failure, between she left and I am unlovable, between I got rejected and I'm the kind of person who gets rejected. The event is identical in both sentences, but in the first, something happened to you. In the second, something was revealed about you. When you fuse the event to your identity, recovery becomes impossible in a very mechanical way. Fixing a bad month is a project you can start on Monday. Fixing who you fundamentally are isn't a project at all. It's a life sentence. And your brain quite reasonably does not attempt tasks it has classified as impossible, so it shuts down. That's not drama. That's the dorsal raphe doing exactly what it evolved to do when there's no available control. The cost is that every setback becomes existential. A missed deadline becomes proof about your future. One bad date becomes evidence about your entire romantic life. You carry every hit you've ever taken into every new room and wonder why you feel so heavy. Which brings us to the real price of all three traps together. You spent years protecting yourself. You avoided the hard conversation. You left the difficult thing undone. You stayed home. You stayed safe. The whole purpose was to make sure you never felt the pain of failing. But your ability to handle pain isn't a fixed tank you were born with, it's built by use. So the exact thing you did to feel safe is the thing that removed your capacity to feel safe. You're more afraid at 30 than you were at 20. And it isn't because life got harder, it's because you got smaller. Protection cost you the thing protection was for. So how do you get out? First, understand what we're not doing. We're not going to stop you feeling the hit. You can't decide not to trip the breaker any more than you can decide not to bleed when you're cut. That mechanism is older than your personality, and it doesn't take requests. Anyone selling you a mind that feels nothing is selling a fantasy, and chasing it just stacks shame on top of pain. The goal is smaller and far more achievable. Shorten the distance between the hit and your first controlled action. That's the entire skill, not the absence of falling, the speed of the reset. Here are 4 laws that build it. Law 1. Find the smallest controllable lever. When your brain scans for control, it doesn't care about the size of what you control. It only cares that something responded to you. So after a hit, stop asking why this happened to me. That question has no lever attached to it. Ask instead, what's the smallest thing in front of me that will move if I push it? Make the bed. Send 1 email, not 20. Wash the dishes in the sink. Walk to the end of the street and come back. It will feel insultingly small next to the size of the problem. Do it anyway. You're not solving your life. You're feeding your prefrontal cortex evidence that your actions still change things. That evidence is what flips the panel back on. Law 2. Choose your stress instead of only receiving it. In 1981, the American telephone industry was deregulated and Illinois Bell went through what was then the largest corporate upheaval in history. A team led by Salvatore Maddi had been studying roughly 400 of their managers for years beforehand and kept following them for years after. 2/3 fell apart. Health problems, divorces, collapsed performance. but 1/3, exposed to exactly the same disruption, came through stronger than they went in. Maddie identified 3 attitudes separating them, and one was this: they treated difficulty as a challenge to engage with rather than a threat to survive. You can't build that attitude by reading about it. You build it by voluntarily inserting controllable hardship back into a life that deleted it. Train when it's cold, have the conversation this week instead of next year, finish the course, sit with boredom for 20 minutes without your phone. Cook the food. None of these matter individually. Together they're reps. You're manufacturing the training data your brain never got. Law 3. Be flexible, not rigid. This one contradicts the picture in your head, so pay attention. George Bonanno at Columbia spent decades tracking what actually happens to people after the worst events of their lives. Across 54 studies covering bereavement, injury, disaster, and combat, around 65% of people showed few or no lasting symptoms. Resilience isn't rare, it's the majority outcome. But when he looked at what those people had in common, it wasn't emotional armor, it was flexibility. They could feel it fully when feeling it helped, and set it down when setting it down helped. They could ask for support on Tuesday and handle it alone on Thursday. They matched the response to the situation instead of having one setting. The rigid mind isn't the strong one. A steel rod doesn't bend right up until the moment it snaps in half. Anyone who's decided they'll never cry, never ask, never need anyone hasn't built strength. They've built a fuse, and fuses only work once. Law 4. Build the thing the hit cannot touch. Maddie's second attitude was commitment. The people who came through Illinois Bell intact had something they were involved in that the upheaval couldn't reach. Work outside the company, their family, a standard for how they behaved regardless of circumstances. This matters because it changes the size of the hit. If your entire identity is your job, losing the job destroys the whole structure. If your job is one of 5 things you are, losing it takes out one wall in a building that still stands. So the question isn't what do I want? It's what do I have that stays standing when the thing I care about most is taken? Build that now while nothing is on fire. Nobody builds it during the emergency. Before you go and do this, you need to know what it costs, because nobody warns you and it catches people off guard. When you genuinely become hard to destabilize, some people won't experience that as admirable. They'll experience it as cold. The friend who used to call you at midnight will find you calm instead of activated, and calm isn't what they came for. Your family, who could always move you by raising their voice or going silent, will find the handle they always used is no longer attached to anything. People don't usually say thank you when they lose leverage over you. They say you've changed, you've gotten hard, you don't care anymore. And there's a second cost, quieter and worse. When you stop visibly falling apart, people stop checking on you. You become the one nobody worries about. The one who's always fine. You'll find yourself carrying real things alone, not because nobody loves you, but because you got so good at the reset that nobody noticed the breaker ever tripped. That's the actual price of a mind that's hard to shake. Not enemies, distance. Go in with your eyes open. Here's what's on the other side of that price. Your capacity to be hurt doesn't disappear. You'll still get blindsided, you'll still have the parking lot night, you'll still take hits that put you on the floor. What changes is the length of the stay. What used to take 9 months takes 4 weeks. What used to take a month takes a day. And eventually something shifts in how you walk into rooms, because underneath your conscious thinking, your brain has finally accumulated enough evidence to believe one sentence. Whatever this is, I've come back from worse, and I know where the switch is. That's the whole thing. Not a mind that can't be knocked down. A mind that stopped being afraid of the floor because it's been there enough times to know the way back up. And this isn't reserved for special people. Emmy Werner spent 40 years following 698 children born on the island of Kauai in 1955, the entire birth cohort. 201 of them grew up under serious risk. Poverty, family instability, complications at birth. Everything predicted they would struggle. A third of them became competent, caring, confident adults anyway. When Werner looked for what saved them, she didn't find genius or unusual talent. She found ordinary things. One adult who paid attention, something they were responsible for, a place where their effort visibly mattered. Viktor Frankl, writing after surviving the camps, argued that everything can be taken from a person except one thing, the freedom to choose their own response to what happens to them. He wasn't describing a superpower, he was describing the last piece of control available when everything else has been stripped away, and he insisted it was always still there. That's what all of this comes down to, not being unbreakable. Just refusing to sit in the dark waiting for someone else to come and flip the switch when the switch has been under your hand the entire time. So tell me, out of the 3 traps, which one has been running your life? Protecting your peace, the fairness contract, or fusing the hit to who you are? Be honest in the comments, and you'll find you're very far from the only person who picked yours. If any of this landed, hit like and share it with someone you know who's been quiet lately. The person who says they're fine and clearly isn't. They probably don't need advice. They just need to hear that what happened to them was automatic and that the reset is learnable. Thank you for staying with me all the way to the end. Subscribe and turn on notifications so we can keep decoding the hidden machinery of the mind together. Goodbye, and see you next time.